Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. Today we're going to talk about the politics of mental and physical fitness and how healthy our elected officials should be. The sudden death of Senator Lindsey Graham and the uncertainty surrounding the state of Senator Mitch McConnell's health has injected new life, no pun intended, into the debate over, one, whether our elected officials need to be able to pass mental and physical fitness tests to stay in office, and two, whether we need maximum age limits on our officials. We have minimum age limits, but many officials don't have maximum age limits. And many government bodies in the U.S., namely Congress, are significantly older than the average population of the citizens they represent. And for some political observers, if you can't get older and unhealthy elected officials out of office at the ballot box, then there need to be laws to force them out. But not surprisingly, these debates are often still subject to partisan and ideological battles. Not in the sense that Republicans support one side of the debate and Democrats support the other. No, it's more because concerns about physical and mental fitness tend to be selectively applied. At least elected officials and political pundits do so. Republicans tend to care about this fitness a lot more when it's a Democrat's health in question, and the same goes for Democrats when it's about a Republican's health. The very first episode of this podcast covered maximum age limits on Congress and the proposals for that. And so I want to revisit some of the points there, but to expand upon that a lot more, especially into the political jostling about age and fitness that doesn't get talked about enough, but also more about these fitness tests that are being proposed as well. So today is all about mental and physical fitness for elected officials, whether we might see more stringent requirements for it, the trickiness in implementing such requirements, how old is too old, how unhealthy is too unhealthy, where do we draw the line for, quote-unquote, too unfit for office, and more. So, here we go. First of all, really want to not hammer the point too much, but it does bear talking about this selectiveness of applying fitness standards, because biased media does cover topics of physical and mental fitness, but typically it's in the context of politicians on the other side of the aisle. We get really wrapped up in the health of people we don't like. You saw Republicans talk about it a lot when it came to Joe Biden, and now you see Democrats talk about it a lot with Donald Trump, but Democrats were a lot more reluctant to talk about Joe Biden's health, and Republicans have been more reluctant to talk about health when it comes to Donald Trump. And so you see a lot of shielding, or at least less attention paid to like-minded politicians from these, whether it's these media outlets or from other political figures when it comes to somebody who's within the party. Republicans are not going to talk as much about Republicans' health, or they'll say that their health is actually really good. And the same thing goes with Democrats about Democrats. And it's not that biased media won't cover the health of their favorite officials, but it tends to be with a lot less scrutiny. Or they want to talk about how we need to be more understanding of their medical issues, whereas that same level of grace is not given to people who are on the other side of the aisle, conveniently enough. But it's not just these political pundits and these media outlets and these politicians. Oftentimes you hear doctors for an elected official, especially when it comes to president, they come out and say, oh, the president is in great health, that this is the healthiest that they've ever been, and this is maybe the most healthy person to have ever occupied this particular office, or some sort of either obviously or subtly over the top description of what these officials are going through. Donald Trump's doctors talked about how much he's in great health. Joe Biden's doctor would have talked about how much in shape that he was in. But of course, they're going to say these things because this is their personal doctor, and they might have a personal rapport with this president or congressperson that's not necessarily about their political views. They might just have built a personal rapport with them, being around them for so long, and also they don't want to get fired by this person that they're the personal doctor for. And there's no legal obligation in most of these cases to actually reveal this info of these medical results. And when these medical results are released, a lot of times it's very selective parts of it, the parts that tend to reflect positively on that person. But you will sometimes see political officials and pundits and influencers and so on call for the retirement or fitness testing for people in their own party. But usually that's because of factional and ideological disputes. A lot of times these people are those who are much more to the right or much more to the left, and the elected official in question is somebody who's quote unquote not conservative enough or quote unquote not liberal or progressive enough. So a lot of times there is still that, even if it's not based on party, there's still ideology at play. I don't want to make it sound like it's all a partisan thing. It's not, but there is a lot of it that is going on. And although substantial proportions of citizens and voters in both major parties have been in support of maximum age limits, you still see some level of partisan bias at play here too. For example, back in 2023, Pew Research Center had polled people about whether they supported age limits on Congress and age limits on the Supreme Court, and there was a difference in support for both of those. And you saw there was a significant proportion of both parties that said there should be age limits on Supreme Court justices, but there was a noticeable difference in party affiliation. 82% of Democrats said that about the Supreme Court, and 68% of Republicans said that about the Supreme Court. And if you follow the Supreme Court at all, you know that they are a decidedly conservative court, and even back in 2023, they leaned that way too. So that, to some extent, explains that difference between Democrats and Republicans. But again, I don't want to just make it seem like everything is just a matter of partisan and ideological battles here. It's not. Because overall, there are significant numbers of Americans, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, that back some sort of way to ensure competency for our elected officials in terms of mental or physical capabilities. But that begs the question, how do we deal with these quote-unquote unfit officials? Or how should we deal with them? Because there's several different ways that could be considered or that have been considered. You have things like maximum age limits, or another way to put it is mandatory retirement ages. Some people suggest, even though it's not directly based on age, they talk about term limits because longer serving officials tend to be older, so they would be the ones that are more subject to these term limits. Then, of course, you have these proposals for mental competency tests, whether they're ones that already exist or ones that would be made specifically for elected officials. And then, maybe not as commonly brought up as mental competency tests, but physical competency tests. Because even though the job is more so mentally based than physically based, physical capability is still quite relevant to this job. And we're definitely going to get to that in just a moment. But first, let's talk about this debate over maximum age limits. And with any sort of debate in politics, you always assume there are at least two sides to a debate. Sometimes there's 3 or 4, but there's always going to be at least 2, no matter how much it seems like one side of the argument is favored. A significant majority of people are backing either competency tests or mandatory retirement ages for elected officials, but there are still quite a few people that don't agree with those. So you have to think about those arguments that are being made. Whenever you're fighting for any sort of reform, no matter how good you think it is, no matter how strongly you feel you are justified, how solid and airtight you think your argument is, you have to understand what the other side is saying. Because even if you do have a quote-unquote objectively better argument, they are still trying to persuade people too. And if you don't take their argument seriously, they might persuade enough people to go against what you're looking for. Whether it's trying to influence lawmakers in Congress or in state legislatures, or if you are trying to pass state constitutional amendments or even an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, or you're trying to win any sort of campaign, you always have to think about what the other side is arguing. Because if you don't, that might be what gets you beat. So you need to understand what the other side thinks and why they think that, so that you can also counteract any of those arguments as well. You need to be prepared for those so that you can more effectively convince people. And so when it comes to these age limit debates, you have to think about what people who support age limits say and people who don't support age limits say. And three of the most common arguments for both of those sides that we'll bring up here. So let's talk about the pro-age limit side. So people who think that there needs to be some sort of maximum threshold for being an elected official. The actual parameters of that we'll get to in a second. But first, people who support a maximum age limit or mandatory retirement age. One of the major arguments they make is that if you have younger people, you have more energetic and fresh ideas, because old people are stale and they're set in their ways and how they think about doing things. Maybe it worked at one point, but it's not working anymore, and you need somebody else that's new. And sometimes it's true, but is it true in X, Y, and Z cases? Pro-age limit people would also argue that older people are more likely to die. Naturally, that's just how things happen. Of course, younger people can also die too, but older people tend to have more health problems. And so not only are they more likely to die while they're in office, if they do die in office, they're more likely to be the ones that need special elections to fill their seat. And you know what elections cost? Money, not just for people that are campaigning for these offices, but to actually hold these elections. And so local governments have to foot that bill predominantly, because local governments are the ones that primarily handle election administration in the United States. And then pro-age limit people also argue that they are better for democracy, these age limits, because it would mitigate entrenchment of these officials, because older people tend to be longer tenured, and so they have more power at their disposal to stay in power. And you see this reflected in the very high incumbency win rates, meaning people who are already sitting in office tend to win re-election to that office at a very high clip. But what about the anti-age limit side? We have to talk about both sides here. So, for people who are anti-age limit, they would say, well, yeah, younger people might be more energetic, but they also tend to be less experienced. They tend to not know things because they haven't had that experience, whereas older people are more experienced with tackling whatever issues have come up. They will also say these anti-age limit, or these opponents of age limits in or for elected officials will say that people age differently. So one person who's quote unquote too old for the office might not be too old in somebody else's case. So you can meet a 70 or 75-year-old who's just not with it, but there's another 70 or 75-year-old who is sharp as a tack and might be more with things than a, say, 35, 40, 45-year-old. And so if you're going to make some sort of standard that people need to abide by, well, then you need to apply it to everybody. And these people who can still perform these duties would then be affected. And also people who are against age limits would also say that it actually hinders democracy to have these maximum age limits because these are inherently ageist proposals. You're targeting people for being too old. And it would also go against the wishes of people who want to keep these older officials in office. They would say, well, for all the complaints that people have about elected officials being too old, well, they keep winning. And so and sometimes even from people who otherwise complain about elected officials being too old. And if that's the case, who are we to tell voters that they can't keep putting these people back in office? And so no matter how much you may agree or disagree with any of those points, all of those arguments can be fair and strong depending on the context. And so you need to be able to counteract any of those things that people say, or you might have to balance to see which one of those arguments is stronger. Do we really get more younger people with more energetic and fresh ideas in one context, but maybe not in another context? And in one context, maybe older people are really more experienced with tackling problems, but in another situation, yeah, they might have the greater experience, but that doesn't mean that they've actually been good at tackling problems. So you see how it becomes much more complicated than people may realize. And another way that might become more complicated is to think about what would these mandatory retirement ages look like, or these requirements specifically for mandatory retirement ages. There is actually one particular area in government that you do see a lot of mandatory retirement ages in, or maximum age limits in, and that is when it comes to state-level judges. 31 states as of 2022 had a mandatory age limit, though what exactly those parameters were differed. Some of them might have had 70 years old, some of them might have had 75, or something a little bit more oddly specific, like 72 or 73. I believe it's Vermont or Rhode Island that has 90, which seems like it. If you are going to have a mandatory retirement age, it seems like 90 kind of defeats that purpose. But maybe it doesn't. Maybe that's just a bias I have. It just seems like it's kind of over the top if you really are going to have a mandatory retirement age. But maybe there's a very specific reason they have it at 90. But in any case, it's one thing to say that we should have a mandatory retirement age, to say that, okay, yeah, people who reach X age, they need to get out of office. Goodbye. You're not running anymore. But it's another to agree on what that age actually looks like. Because what should be that mandatory retirement age? You can have two very staunchly pro-age limit advocates that say, oh yeah, we absolutely need to have a certain maximum threshold for people. But what if somebody really strongly believes it should be 70 years old, and then somebody else says it should be 75? And then you have a third person that comes in and says, that's stupid. It should be 80. And then somebody else comes in and says a different age. What should that age be? Even if we were to say that objectively there should be a maximum age limit, what the best number is for that age isn't necessarily obvious. But not only that, should there be any sort of exceptions to that rule? So if we go back to those state-level judges, there are, in some cases, that judge can serve out the rest of that term that they reach that mandatory retirement age in. So if they were supposed to retire when they were 70, when they turned 75, and they hit 75 in the middle of a 6-year term, well, they would technically be retiring when they're 78. So are those nuances? Is that kind of nuance okay? Or should they only be able to serve to the end of that month that they hit the age, the mandatory retirement age in, and then they have to be replaced? Or can they serve the rest of that term if they hit that age past the halfway point of that term? So if it's a 6-year term, but they hit the mandatory retirement age 2 years in, well, that's not halfway through, so they have to retire. But if they hit that mandatory retirement age 4 years into that term, then suddenly they would be okay to serve the rest of that term out. Should that be okay? Or does it depend on what the office is? Should a president only be able to serve until they're 70, and then the U.S. Senate a U.S. senator should only be able to serve when they're 65, and then a U.S. House member should serve when they're only to 60 years old? Do we make different stipulations depending on the office? And then that's not even counting what if we applied it to state level officials as well, beyond state level judges. I'm talking about like governors, for example, or state legislators. Or could you continue to serve past that mandatory retirement age, but you lose any sort of benefits that you would get, like retirement, if you decided that you were going to keep going? Arkansas state level judges do this, where I believe it's 70 years old that they can serve to, or maybe it's 75. But they don't have to stop at that point. If they don't stop at that point, though, they lose their retirement benefits. So is that something that could be considered for members of Congress or the president or governors or state legislators? And even apart from all of that, can you be exempt if you pass some sort of mental or physical fitness test? So if you're 75, but you're at the top of your game mentally and physically, should you be able to still serve? Some people might say, no, just across the board, don't let that happen. But then somebody might say, well, hang on, what if this person is really good at their job and they show that they can still do it? But then what defines being good at your job when it comes to politics? Because, boy, a lot of people have different ideas of who is good at their job and who is not. But speaking of these fitness tests, though, what would these fitness tests look like? So forget about the age limits. How do we assess physical and mental acuity? Well, first of all, is one of those things trickier to assess than the other? Is it more difficult to assess physical fitness or mental fitness? A lot of times when we're talking about these fitness tests, we're typically talking about the mental side, because you need to be able to think. And there's a lot of thinking that you have to do when it comes to politics. Things get very complicated, but there is some level of physical capability that you need. And not just talking about walking to different rooms for your conference or your committee assignments or going to the full chamber. We're talking about you having to travel back to your districts or having to stay up long nights to get bills drafted and then passed, and doing all sorts of wheeling and dealing behind the scenes to get things figured out, and then also calling constituents, and then not to mention lobbyists being involved. And then you might have to stay awake for long periods of time and for many, many days. So you still need physical capabilities. And so these demands of public office can considerably weaken people physically. You look at presidents, for example, from the beginning of their term to the end of their term, whether they serve 4 years or 8 years, they look like they age a lot more than 4 or 8 years. You talk about George Bush or Barack Obama. They certainly look like they aged a lot more than they actually did. And it's the same case for a lot of other elected officials as well, or even appointed government officials. And so you see some politicians retire not because their mental acuity isn't up to snuff. They might be able to think very clearly and lucidly and quickly, even if you think they're not good at their job or their policies suck. They might mentally be up for the job, but they retire not because of that, but because they are physically exhausted. And so physical fitness might be easier to assess than the mental, because there are arguably more quote-unquote objective ways to measure physical fitness. Or is that even actually true? I might just be talking out of my you-know-what. I might be completely wrong about that. Maybe they're both equally difficult to assess. I mean, both of them are going to be difficult to assess in this context, but is physical or mental fitness necessarily harder to assess? Maybe they're not. But in any case, it's easy to say that we should have these fitness tests, and everybody wants their elected officials to be fit for office. Nobody wants them to be unfit. It's just we disagree about whether somebody is fit or not. But we all want them to be able to be up to the task. But how we come to that conclusion of whether they're up to the task, is where things get murky. And so we can say we should have mental or physical tests, but it's much harder to agree on what those parameters look like. Because you may look at a politician and think that you know mental or physical fitness when you see it, but it's not entirely objective. Not to mention there are partisan or ideological factors at play. You may be a lot more harsh on somebody in their supposed mental or physical fitness because they are somebody that you don't personally agree with. And I think every one of us has been guilty of that at some point. Some people are more guilty than others, but even when we're really trying not to be biased in that regard, we can still have that level of bias. And even with party and ideological considerations aside, someone can appear to be more mentally or physically fit when they actually aren't. And that's not even us being partisan or ideological about it. It's just we just happen to think that they're more fit than they actually are. Maybe the way that they're being covered in the story makes them seem like they're more fit, or we just don't have the information on hand. And so when we create these proposed ideas for physical or mental fitness tests, what should they look like? Here's some things to consider. What questions or criteria should they pass to stay in office? So if you're assessing physical fitness, are we measuring things like blood pressure or how quickly they move or their ability to stay awake in committee meetings? And then if you're talking about mental fitness, are we saying like, okay, do they still remember how the rules of lawmaking work? Are we assessing any sort of weird things that they say? Or trying to think of something else that could be an idea. But sometimes then somebody might think, oh, this person is absolutely out of their mind, and it's really just because they have a policy view that they don't agree with. But then even if you do have some agreement on what questions or criteria they should pass, how many questions or criteria should be passed? You're probably not going to pass every sort of physical capability assessment or mental capability assessment. But if you pass, say, 80% of them, is that good enough? What about 70 or 60 or even 50? If you get below 50%, then you're probably getting a little bit into uncertain territory. But if somebody's passing 60, 70, 80, 90%, is that good enough? And then even if you agree on how many questions or criteria need to be passed in order to stay in office, who is administering this fitness test? Because they could be somebody who has a political objective. They might be somebody who's assessing, if it's a Democrat assessing a Republican, they might be more harsh in their critique. Same thing if it's a Republican assessing a Democrat. And then even if you get somebody to administer the fitness test, who is overseeing that administrator or administrators? Then it starts to get into that whole, like, who's overseeing the overseer? And then, at some point you need to come up with a highest echelon of person who's overseeing things, but you also need some level of accountability and transparency. And also, if you miss that cutoff of, oh, you should have gotten 70% of these criteria in order to stay in office, or 80% or whatever it is, can somebody have a second chance to retake the test? Some people are just really bad at taking tests. Should we allow for that? Or can we say that, well, you know what, they just happen to have a very bad day. Maybe we just need to give them a second shot. Okay? Maybe you give them a second try at it. Can they even get a third try? And then after all of that is figured out, do these full test results become public? That might sound like, well, yeah, of course they should be public. And you hear a lot of times where, even outside of this context, people constantly call for especially for president, call for them to release their educational or medical records. And oftentimes they don't actually release those for one reason or another. But they can't just always say, we're going to request this information and it's going to be given to us. There might be privacy laws involved, especially when it comes to medical records. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But there are all these other obstacles against mandatory retirement and fitness tests that you have to account for. Because even if we have large agreement amongst supporters on what these maximum age limits are going to look like, or what these mental and physical competency tests look like, or do we even care that much about the physical side and we just want the mental side? I don't know. But if we agree on all of those things of what those should look like, now we'd have to actually get those passed. Now we'd have to actually implement them into law. And obviously, that's a lot easier said than done. Otherwise, we'd see these things come to fruition more frequently, and you'd see mandatory retirement ages for a lot more than just state-level judges. And you'd see them in all the states, or most of the states at least. Or the vast majority of states, I should say, because 31 states do have those mandatory retirement ages for state-level judges, but that's still another 19 states that don't have it. And so you might think you have an airtight argument for these reforms, and maybe you do have a really good argument for it. I'm not going to say you do or you don't, but you still have to incentivize lawmakers to pass those reforms for mandatory age limits and or physical and mental capability tests. Assuming you're trying to get the law passed instead of as an amendment. And so if you're going the lawmaking route, if you're going to specific lawmakers, you have to understand that they're balancing not only their own interests, but those of political allies and constituents as well. So a lot of these officials, especially ones who are older themselves, they're probably going to be pretty reluctant to pass these age limit and fitness test requirements unless they were somehow maybe exempt from those requirements. That's another thing to consider too. Are people grandfathered in where their current officials are exempt from these tests, or do they have to, or these age limits, or do they have to abide by them as well? So you're still balancing their own interests, and then their political allies, some of them might be older and they don't want to have these laws on the books that hinder them in their careers. Or what about their constituents? Maybe their constituents don't like these laws because these elected officials that they really support and they've supported for a long time, now they're going to be losing that official if they are subject to these age limit or fitness tests. And in the case of the fitness test, they don't pass. Or maybe one of these constituents wants to run for office themselves and they're older. But fortunately for reformers, this isn't an issue that is divided strictly along party lines. Yes, people selectively apply their standards for physical and mental acuity based on party, but it's not like, Republicans support this idea and Democrats don't, or Democrats support this idea and Republicans don't. It doesn't really work that way. But beyond the incentivizing or the balancing of lawmakers' interests in this regard, another big issue you had to contend with is that you have to make age limits a salient part of the political agenda. Yes, it might be a relevant talking point for media outlets and for regular voters. That doesn't mean that politicians are going to be considering it anytime soon. A lot of times they won't. What their idea of relevant is might be a lot different than what media thinks is relevant, or what the general population thinks is relevant. And you just have so many other issues competing for the spotlight in the lawmaking process at both the federal and state levels that it can be very difficult for something like mandatory age limits to make it into that process. And especially when you're talking about the state level, a lot of these state legislatures have sessions where they're making the vast majority of the laws. They are only going for like maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 months of the year. A lot of them do not even approach a year-round cycle like there is for Congress. And so that constricts the amount of time that you might see this happen at the state level. And then at the federal level, because it's federal, it's nationwide, they have even more issues to think about just because they're covering the whole nation, and because it's the federal government, they're also dealing with the rest of the world too. So that can make things even harder when it comes to trying to make age limits or fitness tests a core part of the political agenda. And also, while many candidates and officials could say they support these ideas, like they do a lot with term limits, you have to make sure they actually follow through on such promises. That's always something I find very interesting whenever I see some sort of reform campaign say so and so says that they support this, and it's very easy to score those simple political brownie points and say, oh yeah, this thing that a lot of people support, I totally support it too. But they don't actually do anything about it. And you see that a lot with term limits. A lot of people blow smoke about how much they support term limits, and we need to get people to cycle through Congress and state legislatures more and more, but they don't actually do anything about it. And you can see that sometimes with these mandatory age limits and fitness tests as well. Now, of course, these reform campaigns are going to highlight these officials that are saying, oh yeah, I'm totally in support of this thing. But it's still something that strikes me as kind of funny, because politicians say lots of things that they don't follow through on. If you go the lawmaking route, you still have to contend with a bunch of other roadblocks that could be thrown in your way as well. And those are things like HIPAA laws that greatly restrict the release of medical records without patient approval. So if we say that you should have to pass a mental or physical fitness test, well, now you got to actually have those results released for people to verify and hold accountable those people that are taking those tests and the people who are administering those tests. But HIPAA laws can really make it very difficult to get a hold of those medical records. Though one could maybe argue that them being a public official entitles them to a lower bar for privacy, which has been a thing in courts, that public figures do have a somewhat lower threshold for privacy than regular private citizens do. And so maybe the argument then is that, well, these medical records are a matter of great public interest. I'm not entirely sure about the intricacies of HIPAA laws, but that might be something that you could argue. But in any case, these medical privacy laws do make it difficult to try to implement something like this. Again, you have accusations of ageism because you're targeting older people. And so you might also run afoul of equal employment laws, which are typically more based on race and gender, but they also do apply to age. And somebody might say, well, you're not entitled to being employed as an elected official, which is quite true. But to flat out tell people that they can't run for the office because they are too old, well, now you might start to run into those issues of equal employment. Then there's also possible constitutional objections, not necessarily for the U.S. Constitution, but there might be state constitutional laws that make it difficult to try to implement an age-based requirement or a fitness test requirement, is because the fitness test would be with age in mind. And so if you run into constitutional objections and it's found that your idea is unconstitutional, you're not going to be going anywhere with it. And in a similar vein to constitutional questions, if you try to get a national limit on Congress passed specifically, now the argument might be, well, that's actually a state political jurisdiction issue. That's actually a 10th Amendment issue, because the state should be able to dictate how old is too old for their elected officials. North Dakota a few years ago did pass a state constitutional amendment that I believe they made it where members of Congress or prospective members of Congress cannot be 80 years old by the time that they in the term that they won election for, I think is what it was. So somebody might come back and say, if you try to apply it to all of Congress, they might say, well, no. This is a states' rights issue. The states have to dictate how old is too old for their elected officials. And then if Congress tries to pass a law for maximum age and fitness test on the president or the Supreme Court, not on themselves, but the other two branches of government, now you're running into an issue with checks and balances. Now, are we saying that, well, Congress is trying to dictate certain parameters of who can serve for president or Supreme Court unlawfully, and they're overstepping their bounds? Now that might run into the checks and balances and separation of powers debates and issues. And then if the lawmaker route fails, then you'd have to go through a state or national constitutional amendment process. And then those are even more arduous most of the time than the lawmaking process, especially if you try to amend the U.S. Constitution. And then you still have to deal with a lot of the same roadblocks, like medical privacy laws and ageism concerns and sorts of other issues with, determining what are the appropriate parameters for age limits and fitness tests. And so you're still running into a lot of those problems that you're already running into with lawmakers. Instead of now, you're not trying to incentivize lawmakers, now you're trying to convince a whole bunch of voters to support that. Or then what if you have the state government try to say that your amendment is illegal because it doesn't pass some sort of legal requirement for an amendment? Like a lot of states, what the amendment is trying to do has to be quote unquote clear and concise, or not necessarily concise, but it has to be clear what that amendment is trying to do. And sometimes the stipulations for what's considered a clear and obvious intent of an amendment is rife with partisan and ideological considerations. But apart from all that, let's say that you are going to get an age limit passed, you're getting a fitness test passed, and you got a whole bunch of people that agree on what that should look like. Okay, great. Well, there is an old saying that goes that you should be careful what you wish for, because you might get what you want and eventually realize it's not quite working out the way that you thought it would or that you had intended. There might be unintended consequences that come up, or you later come to find out that the law you wanted is now negatively impacting you specifically. I'm not trying to say that national retirement age or fitness tests are a bad idea. I'm not here to make public value judgments on these things, even if I have my own opinions one way or another. I'm here to just lay out the actual arguments for both sides to try to give people a more well-rounded, nonpartisan, impartial as possible look at how these things work. But what I am saying is that you must consider the trade-offs that come with policies, because there are always trade-offs. Always trade-offs. No matter what the policy is, no matter how good you think it is, no matter how airtight and foolproof you think it is, there is always going to be something that can be attacked about it. Or not necessarily that it's attacked about it, but at some point in time, that policy might now start to negatively impact you. And so you need to understand that there may be some tough pills to swallow from the effects of these reforms. And sometimes these effects were predictable, and sometimes they aren't. And so, not to persuade or dissuade you from your side of the debate, but there are some things you should carefully think about when it comes to implementing mandatory retirement age limits or fitness tests for physical and mental competence. There is an inevitable loss of institutional knowledge when you force people out because of their age, because older people tend to have been serving longer, which means that they have more experience and knowledge. Now, again, doesn't necessarily mean that they were good at their job, but by default, they're going to have more knowledge about how things work because they were there for longer. Because politics is extraordinarily complicated with its rules about the lawmaking process and the complex relationships between people and on. And you have to think about whether that loss of institutional knowledge is worth the injection of new blood and fresh ideas from people who are new to the game, or at least new to being an elected official, and this ability for more people to be able to directly influence the lawmaking process. Seasoned people aren't necessarily good at their job, and it doesn't mean that new and bold ideas are going to be good either. So you have to think about whether that trade-off is the right one to make in a certain circumstance. And you can't pick and choose certain circumstances where it's, oh, but this older person that I like them. They shouldn't be subject to these fitness tests. Now, it doesn't work like that. You either have to have it across the board, or if you don't have it across the board, you have to have a very specific set of exemptions for how people can evade these mandatory retirement ages or these fitness tests. And that is a nice segue into this next point. At some point in time, if not now, then in the future, these reforms meant to target the age of members of Congress or the age of the president is going to hit politicians that you like. And when we think about these politicians where we want to assess their fitness or impose age limits on, they tend to be ones that we don't like. So when Democrats think about these age limits, they tend to think about guys like the now late Senator Lindsey Graham or Senator Mitch McConnell. Republicans tend to think about people like Joe Biden and the late Dianne Feinstein, who was a U.S. Senator from California. But the thing is, it doesn't just apply to Democrats. It doesn't just apply to Republicans. It applies to both of them. And then it also applies to independents whenever they happen to serve. And in this case, you think about Bernie Sanders. Angus King is also up there in years too, but Bernie Sanders in particular is up there in years. And so if you have these age limits at fitness tests, they start to apply to him too. And somebody who is young now that you may firmly support, they might go on to serve for a long time, and then all of a sudden now they come up on these age limits or these fitness tests. Everybody who is old now was young at one point, and many older politicians started off relatively young. These people who have served 30, 40 years, they were once youthful and energetic and injected bold ideas too. At least according to somebody, they injected bold ideas. But now they're at a point where they're older, and now people are saying, well, now they're too old to serve in office. Young people who are serving now, some of them will run into this same issue. But now you say, oh, wait a minute. No, but not this person. I like this person, though. They're doing a good job. But you can't just pick and choose who to apply these rules to unless, once again, you have those exemptions already set in stone. And then, lastly, what if you wanted to become an elected official one day? Or people that you personally know, like friends and family. Well, if you want to eventually serve, now you might eventually contend with these age limit and fitness test laws. And if you are prepared to do that, then, hey, then I commend you for at least acknowledging that. But some people don't think that far ahead necessarily, and then they think, well, wait a minute, this isn't what I signed up for. Actually, it is what you signed up for. You are not exempt from age limit and fitness test laws if they get implemented just because you don't want to be adherent to them. But that's how it works. So, once again, not to persuade you or dissuade you one way or another. It's just you have to think about these things before you really firmly say, you know what, I do support this. And if you are prepared to face anything that might negatively impact you, then I commend you for that, being willing to accept those drawbacks and acknowledge that those drawbacks exist. But some people don't necessarily think about that ahead of time. And so, even if age limits, maximum age limits, mandatory retirement ages, and fitness tests are the way to go. And we figure out the quote unquote right way to do them. Even so, there's going to be some sort of drawbacks. There's going to be something that is negative about them because every policy has flaws. And so you have to make sure that those are things that you're willing to deal with. And that's going to be the end for today's episode of the Politics with Paul podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening and watching. Links in the show notes, my other works, including my writings on medium.com, my 5-day educational email course about how we can all more effectively mitigate toxicity and polarization in politics, and my book on Amazon about political independence. And my other links, my LinkedIn, my Facebook, my website, and my email. And so that's going to wrap things up here for today. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. And any sort of support that you provide to this podcast helps tremendously in my efforts to help promote civic education and political education and try to make these things more accessible to people. So thank you so much for all that you guys do and for listening to this podcast. And we'll see you next time.